but a miracle energy source this was not.
Just like the old adage about miracle energy sources. If it works, it's a miracle. Welcome back to my reaction to the men who promised unlimited energy. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I'll pin it down below.
It would really be a pity if they blew up Salt Lake City. Then we'd know about yeah.
When it comes to nuclear physics, there are actually 2 F words. Fission, you've definitely heard of.
Oh, there's a lot more than 2 F words.
Splitting the atom. A massive nucleus breaks apart into 2, releasing a massive amount of energy.
Could be 2 or more. There's a term called ternary fission when it actually splits into 3. The distribution looks like this for uranium-235. Nuclear engineers call this the Dolly Parton curve for highly scientific reasons, but it's not directly in half. And when it splits into 3, the third one is usually much smaller, an alpha particle or something of similar size.
So much energy it could start a chain reaction, leading to an explosion so immense it could flatten a city in an instant.
Chain reactions can do that. It's still called a chain reaction in the context of a nuclear power plant, but nuclear power plant, it's controlled and stable. In a nuclear weapon, the idea is to have there be so many what's known as prompt neutrons to make it go prompt critical, which is when just the prompt neutrons by itself that come out in a teeny tiny fraction of a second are enough to make a self-sustaining chain reaction. And it is essential that weapons operate that way, otherwise you're not going to create nearly enough energy to make a bomb. Compare that to nuclear power plants, which are delayed critical. Delayed neutrons that can take on the order of several seconds to come out are what maintain enough neutrons to keep the reaction critical or steady state.
Nuclear fission changed the course of the 20th century, but its sibling, fusion, is even more powerful. The joining of atoms.
More powerful on a per unit mass basis, yes.
When we divide by the amount of mass used for fuel, fusion beats out fission by a factor of 4. All of the atoms around you are made up of protons,
3 to 4 depending on the size, but that's about right.
And neutrons. Bundles of particles, protons with a positive charge and neutrons with none. The smallest possible nucleus is that of hydrogen, with just 1 solitary proton. If you were to take another atom of hydrogen and slowly push them closer and closer together, you would find yourself at war with an immense force. The electromagnetic force repels positive charges away from each other. The closer they get together, the harder it pushes back. But there is a barrier you can surpass. If you were to supply enough force, enough heat, enough pressure, you can get the protons close enough together and a new force dominates, the strong nuclear force.
Problem is the strong nuclear force is very close range, whereas electromagnetic forces are much farther ranges. And by close range, I'm talking 10 to the minus 15.
Small enough scales, it overpowers the electromagnetic force, and the 2 protons fuse together. 2 atoms of hydrogen.
It can, under that specific scenario, granted, hydrogen 1 fusion, I mean, good luck with that. That's not going to release nearly as much energy as what you would have to put in. But there's a reason why heavier atomic nuclei have so many neutrons. It's because that positive charge gets even stronger and stronger that the nuclear force can't even keep them together as effectively. So you need all these neutral charged particles kind of in between them to dilute some of the positive charge in terms of giving spots for more protons and more neutrons to kick onto. That's an oversimplification. Geometry is just one of the factors that gets into how atomic nuclei retain their shape, but that's definitely part of it.
Have become 1 atom of helium, and this releases a ton of energy.
Though hydrogen 1, or protium, I very rarely hear anyone use the term protium to describe basic vanilla hydrogen. It can occur in a star's core, for instance, but it's typically not even attempted on Earth just because it takes so much more that you would have to put into it than how much energy you'd actually get out of this thing.
Much of it in the form of heat. Self-sustaining fusion has been one of the holy grails of physics since the concept was first theorized in the 1920s. The idea that an initial fusion would release enough energy to kickstart a chain reaction, unleashing more energy than it took to start the first one. Fusion is all about probabilities. If you have two nuclei close enough together for a long enough period of time, there is always a chance, no matter how infinitesimal, that they will overcome their repulsion and fuse.
I would expand on that and say you can expand that out to nuclear physics in general being all about fusion. The same is the case with fission. An incident neutron about to hit a uranium nucleus, or really anything. There's a non-zero probability it's going to cause fusion, it's going to cause fission, even something that isn't fissile like iron. It's extremely low and you're not going to see it, but it's technically not impossible.
The way you can increase the odds of fusion is to add neutrons. This is deuterium. One proton, one neutron.
Smiley.
Although it sounds like another element entirely, it is really just a variant of hydrogen.
It is. Hence the term, some people also refer to hydrogen 1 as protium, but that's pretty rare.
Heavy hydrogen. Because neutrons have no charge, they provide a bit of a buffer. It's much easier to fuse two deuterium atoms than two hydrogen atoms.
Deuterium is also used in fission. Can-do reactors use it in their water. So water in any water reactor acts as a moderator and a reflector. Back to the probability discussion. Water drastically increases the probability that a neutron is going to fission a uranium-235. Heavy water, which is deuterium, which the hydrogen H2O is actually deuterium, is an even better moderator. So much to the point where you can use natural uranium with way less than 1% uranium-235 compared to enriching up to 3 to 5% for a typical light water or non-deuterium water reactor. The trade-off, though, is you're enriching your water with deuterium versus enriching your uranium with uranium-235.
In the modern day, we try to induce fusion in gigantic reactors called tokamaks, donut-shaped rooms that trap protons with immense magnetic fields. However, despite our best efforts, the energy we get out is always less than the energy we put in.
There have been some exceptions, but even if it's 1-to-1, you need a lot more than that for it to be economically viable. I've heard some people throw around numbers like 10-to-1, 20-to-1. Probably need closer to 50 to 100-to-1, like you would for any other method of generating power, though, for it to be economical, in terms of how much energy it costs versus how much energy it produces.
Self-sustaining fusion has only been observed in 2 places. Here's the first.
Sun. Yes.
And here's the second.
And the second, the fusion doesn't last very long in a nuclear weapon, because you essentially burn all your fusion fuel out in a tiny fraction of a second. The sun definitely takes the cake in having been around for billions of years versus billionths of a second. So by the time you see the fireball of a nuclear explosion, the fusion reaction was ancient history.
Immensely huge ball of gas that warms our planet and grows our crops, and the H-bomb. A device so destructive that if it was used for its original purpose, it would doom us to extinction.
No, it really wouldn't, unless you built, like, way more than we ever had. Nuclear weapons are powerful, but their destructive power in terms of making humans extinct, highly overrated. That's the topic for a whole other video.
Sustained hot fusion in a lab would fundamentally alter our society. But hot fusion was not a widely used term in the 1980s.
By hot, we're talking upwards of 150 million degrees Celsius.
When physicists spoke of fusion, it was implied that it had to be hot. Of course, that all changed on March 23rd, 1989. Like any good mythology, the early history of their cold fusion project has varied over the years. Fleischmann has said that they were inspired during a hike in Mill Creek Canyon. Later that day, they pulled an all-nighter, frantically writing down calculations and sketching out an experiment.
Shall we tell the truth? Yeah. It was in one of our Jack Daniels phases.
According to Fleischmann, their convo went a little like this. Quote, "It's 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance. Shall we do it?" To which Pons said, "Let's have a go." Fleischmann's decades-long career meant he was familiar with dozens of material systems, and he had done extensive work with palladium. Palladium is a decently rare metal which can absorb surprisingly large amounts of hydrogen, It was almost like a metal sponge.
Okay, I think I know where this is going, because palladium can absorb hydrogen, but can it give you the pressure, temperature, and confinement time that you need to induce nuclear fusion?
And he wrote about it in a paper as early as 1948. A palladium lattice can absorb about 900 times as much hydrogen inside the same volume. And as it fills up, it also expands slightly, and the internal pressures increase dramatically.
DPD. Oh, Lord.
The effect is the same if you swap out hydrogen for deuterium. Fleischmann's thinking was that you could load up a palladium lattice with so much deuterium that it would compress the atoms so tightly that some of them could undergo fusion.
No. I mean, it can absorb the deuterium. I buy that. I mean, it's chemically identical to hydrogen. You could even drink heavy water and you'll be fine. I wouldn't drink large quantities of it. I mean, the amount of toxic dose of that is probably little less than a toxic dose of water. So don't drink, gallons of the stuff. But not to mention it's way more expensive.
And all that could be done at room temperature. A colleague at Southampton said that Fleischmann mentioned this idea to him as early as 1974, but it wasn't until he went to Utah to work with Pons that he had someone willing to try it out.
What do we got going on here?
In order to load the palladium with deuterium, they devised the following setup. They take a battery and hook it up to two electrodes. One is platinum and one is palladium. Next, they submerge this into a giant water bath. Except this isn't regular water, H2O. This is heavy water, D2O. The hydrogen is replaced with deuterium.
I don't like the term D2O because, again, it's hydrogen. D2O almost implies it's a completely different element, but it's really not. It's just a different isotope.
Heavy water is not exactly common. It makes up only about 0.0156% of the Earth's total water. But for chemists, it's easy to get their hands on. Next, they dissolve some lithium into the heavy water. Lithium is a conductor, and they plan to run electricity through the water. When the electricity is turned on, the heavy water molecules, D2O, are split apart through electrolysis. They separate into oxygen and deuterium. The oxygen is negatively charged and floats over to the anode, and the deuterium is positively charged and floats over to the palladium cathode. The palladium acts as a sponge and absorbs the deuterium atoms. And theoretically, when the palladium is loaded up with as much deuterium as physically possible, fusion might occur.
So it says crazy pressure. I mean, you're going to need some crazy pressure.
How would they be able to tell, though? By measuring the temperature of the water. If the heat energy released was more than the amount of electricity pumped in, that would be excess heat.
Or you can have an exothermic chemical reaction, possibly due to some contaminants in there. Though they said earlier they used radiation detectors, so let's see where that factors in.
A potential new energy source. Although it takes some work to get, oceans have enough heavy water to last us centuries. Certainly much more renewable than oil or natural gas, and with none of the pollutants. This experiment was...
And yet, we can use the deuterium. We can use it in fission reactors as the moderator, just like they do at scale in Canada today, and even in this time period in the 80s.
Not an entirely new idea, however. In the 1920s, a German group was trying to find a reliable way to produce helium. Following World War I, Germany had been...
Okay, this is a thing. I was thinking, helium-26. That's how I read that. 2 protons and 24 neutrons, thinking its half-life is near 0.
And from importing it, so a reliable way to make it in a lab would be a game changer. They had tried loading palladium up with hydrogen and saw some evidence of helium. However, this work was fairly obscure, and it had been forgotten about for decades, largely because the authors eventually retracted their work. They realized they had made a mistake. The helium they were seeing had been absorbed from the air and not produced via fusion.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're looking at, probability functions, the odds of interactions with air, interactions with contaminants, either it be from your lab or from your D2O that you're using, no, I hate that term, is way more likely to cause chemical reactions, even lower probability chemical reactions.
Of course, the neutron wasn't even discovered until a few years later, and so they wouldn't have known to use deuterium rather than hydrogen. Fleischmann had heard of this work before. as he briefly overlapped at the same school as one of the authors in the 1950s. And so, all these years later, Fleischmann had taken that general idea, but swapped out hydrogen for deuterium. Pons and Fleischmann said several things in this press conference they will later come to regret. The first was calling the phenomena a sustained fusion reaction.
Ooh.
The second was claiming that the experiment was, quote, very simple, and implying it would be easy to reproduce. Fleischmann will later say he regrets doing the press.
I'm wondering how you would you even scale this? I guess you could just use this magical lattice engineering, this DPD lattice, to create palladium fuel cells of a sort. Because that's kind of what this is reminding me of. So the reaction rate would have to be crazy high per cell, and yeah. But ultimately, this is going to be your heat source, and you're going to use a turbine just like anything else.
Conference at all. He knew that by going public like this, they were opening themselves up to more scrutiny than they'd ever seen before. He thinks that Pons may not have realized that at the time. Fleischmann is close to retirement here, and he could have left the field any day if he ever chose to. When they write his obituary, cold fusion will be just a paragraph among several in a long and successful career.
I really thought he was going to say they would also be writing the obituary for cold fusion.
Pons, though, is younger and with children still in school. He was not prepared for how this would upend his life. By the end of it, he will be left so defeated that he'll give up his U.S. citizenship.
Whoa.
We did it for the first time anywhere.
A big step forward in a little test tube.
What could be the discovery of the century.
Loving
The dawn
80s
of a new
hairstyles.
nuclear age. They have successfully maintained a nuclear fusion reaction and generated more energy out than they put in.
It was like an avalanche. There was no news channel you could flip to that wasn't
There's your self-sustaining reaction like that right there.
running a cold fusion story. Most of the initial headlines portrayed the announcement as an earth-shattering discovery that may change physics as we
Fusion
know
in
it.
a jar.
This was a potential solution to the energy crisis.
Clean nuclear power. Period. At an affordable price.
1 cubic foot of seawater contains enough deuterium to produce 250,000 BTU of energy. It would take 10,000 tons of coal to equal that kind of energy.
Oh boy.
No more acid rain from burnt coal and other power plants.
And the exhaust of the automobile's internal combustion engine would be a thing of the past.
Nuclear fission had become a political nightmare following the Chernobyl disaster.
Yeah. It would.
And the Exxon Valdez oil spill had occurred literally the same day as the announcement.
The fact is there are a lot of people, including the Chase Manhattan.
Note the difference though. The Exxon Valdez oil spill, no one questioned shutting down any sources of oil, but people are too afraid of nuclear.
Bank who are going to find themselves broke if oil doesn't stay at $20 a barrel.
The Middle East crisis gets settled
That's dating it. Ooh, $20 a barrel. Okay.
just like that because there's nothing to fight over.
The headlines wrote themselves. Two local papers, the Salt Lake City Tribune and the Deseret News, would religiously follow the story with a sense of hometown pride. In the latter case, I mean that literally. Deseret News is owned by the Mormon Church.
I was going to say Deseret.
Not all
sounded
reactions
Mormon.
were also positive, though. Many outlets took a more mixed stance. Some were outright skeptical. For some papers, it wasn't even worth a front-page story. The New York Times squirreled it away on page 12. Optimistic, incredulous, there was an entire spectrum of emotions, but everyone was paying attention. There was a distinct third type of reaction that went on largely behind closed doors, however. Did this have the potential to be turned into a weapon? Or if not a weapon, a source of fuel for one? Countries without nuclear weapons programs may have just been handed a golden ticket. Governments around the world scrambled to ask their top scientists their opinions.
Using that as a weapon, you're better off just spraying water on people with hoses.
At the University of Utah, things quickly devolved into a madhouse. Following the press conference, Marvin Hawkins led the media through a tour of the lab, explaining the setup. The kitchen comments were bang on. It looked like something a hobbyist could do in their basement. Car batteries, a Rubbermaid wash tub.
If this was possible, Styropyro would have done it by now. Get these guys.
All right next to a janitor's closet. This was certainly not like the hot fusion tokamaks that were the size of entire buildings and cost $500 million to run. News TV crews were wandering the halls of the university looking for anyone willing to be interviewed.
Also, tokamaks only costing $500 million to run. I mean, I think we're still talking in the context of the 80s, right?
Many had no idea about the experiment, but hey, it was a chance to be on TV.
What are they doing? The experiments and things.
Do you know what it is?
Well, I have an idea.
I really don't.
What's your idea?
Well, it has to do with energy.
This openness will soon be replaced by the opposite. U of U will lock down external access to the lab, even covering up some windows. The school's phones were ringing off the hook. Hundreds of calls a day, from every walk of life. Politicians like Al Gore called in, offering congratulations. Pons got personal calls from Edward Teller, the controversial father of the hydrogen bomb, and Carlo Rubbia, director of CERN. But they were also flooded with random people looking to invest, or cranks who wanted to talk about their pet conspiracies. Fleischman and his wife were quickly assigned a pair of bodyguards to follow them wherever they traveled. Soon, Pons had to change his home phone number, otherwise it would be ringing all night. The attempt to capitalize on the phenomenon was immediate.
Yes, using the U. Surprised they didn't make the U bigger.
The U started selling cold fusion t-shirts. A soda shop down the street had a novelty cold fusion drink. Many
Cold fusion would be a good name for a drink. Everyone wants a cold one, right?
Researchers, when they first heard of it, were dumbfounded. Cold fusion was a nonsense concept, right?
It would be the most significant technological discovery since man discovered fire.
This had come out of nowhere. If anything, you'd expect it out of a place like MIT, or one of the big federal labs like Los Alamos or Oak Ridge. Some didn't even dare touch the subject. Quote, "It's gotta be wrong. I'm afraid we'll look like idiots if we're seen trying this thing." But on the other hand, Pons and Fleischman were not complete nobodies. They had some level of credibility, and they wouldn't make an announcement like this without solid proof. And hey, Fleischman had said that the experiment was very easy to...
They should have waited at least for some aspects of peer reviewing and reproducibility, though. Doing a one-off like this, the fact that they were nervous about the press conference and even getting this out there, that should tell you something.
Replicate. And the materials were cheap and easy to get. Why not take a week to try and get their own versions going? This was basically just a modified electrolysis setup. Quite literally something that high school students do in their chemistry classes.
I remember
You just
doing
needed
that.
some palladium and some heavy water.
Yeah, just slightly different ingredients. More expensive ingredients, but still.
Those who were quick on the draw were lucky, as soon palladium stock prices were about to spike.
But in the past 2 months, palladium has been the most profitable mineral.
I think we ran from about $142 up to $180 at one point in time.
Some groups even managed to track down Pons and Fleischman's supplier, Johnson Matthey.
It's crazy how something which is effectively a groundless claim at this point can have so many ripple effects. I mean, yeah, I know that's economics in a nutshell, but still.
Although their palladium was standard stuff they sold off the shelf, they did start marketing it as, quote, fusion grade. And so began the cold fusion mania that swept the United States. But this was not just an American phenomenon. Cold fusion had captured the attention of the entire planet.
But as scientists around the world attempt to recreate the experiment in their own labs, fusion has turned to confusion.
I've logged 63 or 64 laboratories trying to do the thermal experiment, and I can say honestly that not one of those laboratories is doing it the same way that we did.
It didn't take long for them to realize that the announcement lacked a bunch of critical details. Here's just a short list. What size were the palladium rods? How are the rods made? Are they machined
want to keep it a
or
secret.
cast? Is the surface of the rod baked, etched, or left alone? How much deuterium needs to be loaded into the rods? How long did it take to load the deuterium? Hours? Days? Weeks? What current should you supply? Should the current change over time? Which electrolyte do you add to the water? Was there any stirring done to the liquid? All legitimate questions that could have a major impact on the results. Everyone knew that a paper was in the works, but only a select few had managed to see a copy. Most of what people had to go on was a story that evolved into a key part of cold fusion's mythology. The meltdown. The meltdown is supposedly the first time Pons and Fleischman saw something that might suggest fusion. Exact dates for this meltdown are inconsistent and hazy. They stretch back as early as late 1984 or early 1985. Why then specifically? Well, notably, it would be the earliest possible time where they could have come up with their experiment but also late enough that both Pons and Fleischmann had fully left their prior jobs at Southampton and the University of Alberta. Any potential patent rights would fall only to them and the University of Utah.
There we go.
According to the mythology, they had been loading a palladium electrode for 7 entire months. And then one night, Pons had instructed his son Joey, who was working in the lab, to adjust the current running through the cell. His son did as he was asked, left, and then returned hours later to check on the experiment. What he saw was astounding. A 1 centimeter cube of palladium, which is a melting point of 1500 degrees, had fully melted. Exact details are, again, inconsistent. In some versions of the story, the rest of the setup melted too. In others, it was a mini explosion.
Okay.
In some versions, Joey had lowered the current. In others, he had raised it. There is one detail that remains consistent, though. There was a hole in the concrete floor 4 inches big. At least one independent source.
I mean, excess heat generation from fusion could cause that without enough cooling, but I'm gonna say I'm skeptical because I don't think that's what it was. Could potentially have excessive hydrogen gas, and by hydrogen I'm still meaning deuterium in this context. I mean, it still has properties of hydrogen gas. Could cause mechanical stresses or something. Could be a chemical reaction with the electrolyte along with contaminants from the lab. I'd believe any of those other things over fusion.
Pons' grad student, Kevin Ashley, confirmed that he saw the hole the next day. Something had generated a shocking amount of heat. So much heat that it could not have been explained by any chemical reaction.
Really?
The only logical conclusion, according to Pons and Fleischmann, was that something nuclear had just occurred. And it was—
I mean, you could have had a thermal runaway condition that exists in any battery operations, including lithium-ion batteries that you see today, albeit a heavily localized one. But who knows?
Stories of this meltdown that supposedly convinced the university that this discovery was genuine, leading to the eventual press conference.
I don't know. I mean, even if that's what caused it, proving it just because your equipment broke, to me, is questionable. I would at least try it again to see if you can get these results to repeat or figure out what broke, that sort of thing.
And yet, there exists no official university records of this meltdown from the time it supposedly occurred. Fleischmann, years later, claimed that they had covered it up out of fear of having their experiment shut down as a clear fire hazard. But regardless, the meltdown story would be a particular point of fixation among scientists. Because even though the story lacked hard numbers, it still implied them. A 1 centimeter palladium cube has a melting point you can estimate, and you can calculate how much energy would be necessary. So does a 4-inch hole in concrete. Researchers would soon be working backwards from what little info they had. The first week was a mad dash to uncover as much information as possible. Researchers phoned their friends to brainstorm, faxes of rough drawings and calculations sent out across the country. People even analyzed footage of Pons holding one of his cells and used the size of his wrist to try and guess at the dimensions of the cell. There are even alleged reports that some people managed to crack their way into Pons' personal email hoping to snoop for answers, but found nothing of interest. Back then, the internet was still in its infancy, and barely anyone called it that yet. But universities and research labs were some of the first in the world with access to it, making cold fusion one of the first ever viral news stories. Early bulletin boards hosted daily news updates, and information was spreading faster than it ever could before. Very few people were able to speak with Fleischmann and Pons directly, save for a few of their close friends. Chuck Martin at Texas A&M had known Pons for years, and had heard a few days beforehand that he'd want to keep an eye on the news. Chuck Martin—
the Texas A&M logo will always read ATM to me—
was extremely eager to get his own cold fusion experiment running, and he phoned Pons asking for any tips. But Pons only gave him cryptic warnings about the potential danger. It seems this was sage advice, as some labs were about to prove.
The Lawrence Livermore labs got a reaction they did not expect. Their experiment blew up.
But the hydrogen gas apparently caused a small explosion, which sent shards of glass all over the lab.
So deuterium is still hydrogen. It still has similar properties to hydrogen gas. The difference is it's heavier, like it'll blow up.
North Carolina State University scientists earlier suspended their fusion experiment following a small explosion.
And Fleischmann had given some friends at Harwell Labs an early head start. He'd been shipping them some of their cold fusion cells throughout March for them to measure. He wanted at least one UK lab to get a head start so the US didn't get all the glory. It's around this time criticism starts to pour in. So far, the best sources for hard numbers were newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times.
In all of this, what has been the most frustrating thing for you?
The most frustrating part is not having enough details to replicate the experiment, or trying to get the details out of newspapers. This is not usually the way we do science.
Why had the press conference come before a peer-reviewed paper? For many people, that was a major faux pas.
Not aware that we did anything at all wrong. We were very cautious not to say that papers had been accepted anywhere.
Pons and Fleischmann had, in fact,
it just seems like you're doing scientific method steps out of order to me,
submitted their paper a couple weeks earlier to the Journal of Electroanalytical Chemistry. And although it hadn't been published yet, it had been accepted. Where this gets iffy is why it was accepted. You see, a couple weeks before the announcement, Pons had received an unrelated call from a friend who was an editor at the journal. Pons and Fleischmann had published often with them before, and Fleischmann was a longtime friend of the managing editor, Roger Parsons. Parsons, upon hearing that his friends may have the discovery of the century, and that they had a tight deadline, tells Pons that he'll push it to be published as soon as possible. Parsons was the only person to review the paper. Pons and Fleischmann had also sent a paper to the
That's a red flag, lack of number of reviewers too.
Much more prestigious Nature, but they had refused to publish it without a much more careful review. There's more to that side of the story later. The paper was eventually published on April 8th, but the preprint leaked a little earlier. Pons had given 5 copies to friends in Utah. These were quickly faxed and copied across the entire world so many times that most of the text quickly became unreadable, except of course for the massive stamp that read confidential. But even this paper was only 8 pages and had little new that people didn't already know. The assumption many were working on was that Pons and Fleischmann were intentionally withholding details because of concerns. Some people even were intentionally withholding details because of patent concerns. Because of patent concerns. Some people even speculated that the cells they showed off on TV were dummies, and that deep in their basement lab, they had their real heavy-duty cells hidden. The press release given to the media by U of U's comms department was also devoid of many details. Pam Brogle, the school's comms director, later said that she was actually forced to remove sentences at the request from the university's legal teams, which she fiercely disagreed with. And yes, that was teams, plural. She noted that there were 3 separate groups of high-powered lawyers, ones from the East Coast, West Coast, and Texas. She had wanted to speak to Pons and Fleischmann well in advance, but had only been allowed to just days before the announcement, leaving her no time to research. Although the press conference was heavily promoted by the school, the exact topic was not fully revealed beforehand. Despite this, at least 3 reporters had managed to get an inside scoop. One of them was Jerry Bishop at the Wall Street Journal. Brogle, who wanted to guarantee coverage from the journal, tells him it's room temperature fusion. Despite his initial skepticism, he too ends up making some calls to physicists and pieces together that this story is a major deal. And his headline, Taming H-Bombs, was certainly not the kind of thing you expect to see in a financial paper. Jerry Bishop's coverage of cold fusion is some of the most in-depth in the traditional media sphere. He will later win a science writing award from the AIP. However, it should be noted that his award ceremony will also be boycotted by many physicists. They found his reporting misleading and often one-sided. Some actually credit Jerry Bishop with popularizing the name cold fusion, because as you'll see in their written press release, Pons and Fleischmann called their discovery N-fusion. Jerry Bishop did not come up with the term cold fusion on his own, however.
Just call it what it is, confusion. Different emphasis on the word con.
And you'll find out who did a little later on. Nothing was conventional about cold fusion, and it was only going to get weirder from here. By mid-April, the first reports from other labs began to roll in. Pons and Fleischmann had set the precedent that if you had a result, you were fine to hold a press conference before you even had a paper published.
Yeah.
And that's what many of these labs did. Called in the media, put on their best suits, and got their 15 minutes of fame. It's rare for scientists to get on TV, and this might be their only shot.
Hundreds of laboratories have tried to confirm the Utah experiment. It looks as though Texas A&M won the race, with Georgia Tech a close second.
We found that there is more energy coming out of this cell than we are putting in. We couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe it.
But then another announcement from another school.
This is so sketchy and bad for science.
School, Georgia Tech. Researchers there duplicated the Utah experiment.
I went to Georgia Tech, by the way.
And this weekend, 2 Hungarian researchers say
The University of Washington.
Italian news reports Stanford researchers today.
Everywhere.
2 Mexican scientists say government project in India.
Researchers at the University of Florida.
Swedish physicists said today.
The University of Minnesota.
The Los Alamos National Laboratory, New Mexico.
Incidentally, this brings to more than 60 the number of laboratories that have confirmed at least part of the Utah experiment.
Okay, well, here's your public peer review, I guess.
Over the next few weeks, Pons and Fleischmann would be traveling non-stop.
I wonder if it was BobbyBroccoli's intent to say new fire, as in, like, not that they discovered fire, but they ended up lighting a firestorm here.
Fleischmann had gone to Europe the day after the announcement, and he had given talks at some of the top physics labs on the continent. Harwell in the UK, Ares in Italy, and now CERN in Switzerland. He was filling auditoriums beyond capacity each time. Pons was just as in demand, and he had given talks at U of U, Indiana, and soon he would give the biggest talk of his life. Cold fusion was such a big deal that nearly every major scientific organization decided to hold emergency sessions entirely dedicated to the subject. And for a chemist like Pons, there was no bigger stage than the American Chemical Society. They had scheduled a meeting in Dallas on April 12th. They had booked out a basketball stadium, and early registration suggested that chemists all across the country would swarm the event.
Dr. Pons has been escorted around Dallas much the way you would escort around a presidential candidate or even a president himself. Incredible for a chemistry convention. It felt like a Jazz-Lakers 7th game in the playoffs. I'll tell you one thing, it was quite a day.
The first day of the conference, the arena has 7,000 people in it. Looking back, many call this event the Woodstock of chemistry. As a comparison, the American Physical Society had their own Woodstock event just 2 years earlier. When a group had found evidence of high-temperature superconductors, that work had won its discoverers the Nobel Prize. Every chemist in the country wanted to see their new...
Now, superconductors, I mean, that's closer to fusion than this is, because superconductors are used in, like, ITER, large-scale tokamaks. It creates strong magnetic fields needed to stabilize and control the hot plasma needed to induce nuclear fusion. Though what's interesting is the superconductors themselves need to be maintained at very low temperatures, typically using cryogenic design. There's your cold part of fusion we can tack on there.
Hero, Stanley Pons. The president of the society opened his talk with a bit of a jab at their rival field of physics.
While much has been learned about plasma physics, the goal has remained elusive. Now it appears the chemists may have come to the rescue.
That's funny.
Although intended as a lighthearted comment, it cut to a real feeling among chemists. The physics community was still extremely pessimistic.
Yeah.
Many of them had ties to traditional hot fusion research. Cold fusion would certainly disrupt their funding, and so they'd have an incentive to criticize it.
Competition over
the
funding.
energy in the room was electric. Right as Pons is being introduced, the MC takes a moment to announce some breaking news.
Before I have Stanley come on up, I'd like to comment. We were just informed before we came on that a Dallas radio station has reported that the University of Moscow has just announced that it has successfully repeated the Pons-Fleischmann experiment.
Add another one. Ooh, but it's the Soviets, though.
History is being made during the event itself. As for Pons, he's clearly much more comfortable now than he was in Utah. He opens with a joke.
It's incredible to me what an electrochemist has to do today to get an invitation to the American Chemical Society.
Most of his talk is just him going over the experiment, but he finds time for another joke.
The next slide is a photograph of the U1 Utah tokamak.
It's a clear flex. Hot fusion tokamaks are the size of entire rooms and weigh tons. His can sit in a Tupperware container. The applause he gets at the end is what you'd expect a rock star to get at the end of a concert.
Thank you very much.
No diving into the crowd.
During the Q&A, one of the audience members asks Pons a question. Prometheus, Pandora, or Piltdown Man? 3 options for how this could turn out. Was this like stealing fire from the gods? Was it like unleashing a curse upon mankind that could not be undone? Or was it simply a hoax? Pons' response was short. No comment. Meanwhile, Pons and Fleischmann were not the only two who'd had a busy couple weeks. Chase Peterson, not wanting to waste the momentum of the publicity, flew out his team and personally visited the Utah governor at his vacation house. The governor could tell they weren't there just for pleasantries and asked them point blank how much money they wanted. When they say around 2 or 3 million, he hits back with 5.
We will hold a special session of the legislature with one item on the agenda. That item will be to deal with the $5 million appropriation.
A state senator, Eldon Money, even suggested a proposal where Utah residents could donate to the research and receive tax cuts in return.
Some believe it will do for Utah what gambling does for Nevada. With so much money coming in, who needs taxes?
The results show that 60% of those who called thought taxpayers should pay for the research. 40% said no, taxpayers should not.
On April 7th,
I mean, look, of all the things that taxpayers are paying for, I mean, fusion research, real fusion research, I mean, I'm sure there are worse things.
The Utah legislature will vote 97-3 to approve the $5 million.
Wow.
But it's kind of like politics. They're certainly generating a lot of heat.
During the session, the governor paraphrased the Bible when expressing his support. He that doeth nothing is damned, and I don't want to be damned. This was an energy source so plentiful, it would be, quote, too cheap to meter. Most of this $5 million would presumably go to some sort of research institute, although almost immediately $500,000 is allocated entirely to the army of patent lawyers. Who would run this institute? Surely the competition would be fierce. The earliest rumor was James Fletcher, who had just retired as head of NASA, a perfect fit given he was a Mormon from Utah. This appointment would not pan out.
That matters.
But it did show just how much interest was being generated. The eventual name would be the National Cold Fusion Institute. Of course, looking at that name, it implies at least some sort of collaboration with the rest of the country. Washington was absolutely paying attention to cold fusion, and things were already in motion. On April 13th, Glenn Seaborg got a phone call in a California diner. It's from Washington. He needs to take a flight there because it's urgent. This is not the first time he's done this. He's a well-respected veteran in nuclear science. In a few years, he'll get a chemical element named after him. He's been a personal scientific advisor to half a dozen US presidents. And George Bush wants his opinion on cold fusion. When he gets there, he tells Bush, his chief of staff, and Secretary of Energy, James Watkins, his honest opinion. This wasn't going to be anything.
There wasn't enough evidence there to convince me, and I'm not convinced yet. Everybody knows about it. Nearly everybody is talking about it, but most of the people I've talked to are not buying it.
But at the same time, you couldn't just declare it wrong. The world was paying attention. Cold fusion looked like a solution to the energy crisis. If you're going to evaluate this, you need to do it slowly. Make a panel, have them visit the labs, and write a big report. Don't rush it out. Secretary Watkins...
Yes, you don't want to make the same mistake that they did with just trying to get the media out there to quickly even to just say it's wrong. Do the opposite. Actually do what they should have done when initially going with this experiment, and just give it a rigorous, peer-reviewed reproducibility evaluation that'll basically tell you one way or the other. And I know I've put this down because I know we don't live in a cold fusion paradise right now. I have a sense of how it ends, though I don't know exactly what happens to all the individuals involved. Yeah, as a minimum, an arduous review process.
Orders a dozen of the country's national labs to start working on cold fusion. And none of this secrecy business. If there's a confirmation, he wants to know immediately. This was not the only major development in Washington that month.
This is not a science project. This is an American project, quite frankly, and a Utah project.
So I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we ought to jump right on it and not let anybody else steal this thing. And
the last 20 years are full of American inventions and Japanese promotion. We'd like to have both opportunities.
In the House, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee held a hearing on April 26th. With 42 members, it is one of the largest committees in the House, and that day there was full attendance. The opening remarks are full of pomp and circumstance.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. In recent weeks, an atmosphere of high excitement and anticipation has permeated the scientific community as startling possibilities for sustained nuclear fusion reactions at
nuclear
room temperature have emerged. The potential implications of a scientific breakthrough that can produce cold fusion are, at the least, in our judgment, spectacular.
We all want this to work. Energy is the lifeblood of our nation, and fusion energy would be an enormous step toward the goal of energy independence.
I mean, look, jokes aside, I agree. It would have been really cool if this would have worked.
In a period when our news seems to be filled with items telling us about drugs, budget deficits, a decline in America's economic position, and environmental problems, the news of the possible discovery of cold fusion in Utah, with its accompanying controversy, was wonderful news.
Wayne Owens, congressman from Utah, was eager to introduce the distinguished guests from his home state.
The possible achievement of solid-state fusion, or the so-called cold fusion, is nothing less than a miracle.
Later, he would make plans for a trip with his fellow committee members to go visit U of U and see cold fusion with their own eyes. The first guest to speak is Stanley Pons, clearly quite humbled and honored to be speaking in Congress.
The one thing about those microphones is they're not that good, so you have to pull them closer.
Okay, thank you very much. Chairman, first we would like to thank you and the committee for the opportunity to testify here today.
He starts us off with a fairly in-depth explanation of the nitty-gritty technical details. He has a slideshow that lasts for nearly 15 minutes. Fleischman is up next.
I was going to say, there's not a whole lot of complexity to this versus if you're going to try to explain a tokamak or really any nuclear fission reactor.
And does what he does best, giving a digestible big-picture view and speculates about how this could be applied. Notably, he says something interesting here.
Now, the experiment which Professor Pons has described to you is superficially simple, but is actually quite difficult to carry out because you have to go through a process of optimizing the experiment such that you will make a significant observation.
This is in contrast to the initial press conference, where he said it was, and I quote, very simple. Although most of the politicians in attendance were enraptured, some of them asked the occasional tough question.
I must say, Mr. Chairman, the process so far by which we've learned about this has been more confusion than cold fusion. And there seems to be a feeling about that the process has been more driven by a wish to protect future potential profits than it has been adherence to normal peer review processes.
Who knows what's up?
Public release of the information prior to the publication in a journal, and the fact that the lack of data seems to have inhibited the replication of your results in most cases where it's been tried.
In chemistry, it is generally the situation that when you have submitted a paper and the paper is accepted, which was the case in our case, then it is okay to make an announcement. I think that the problem we've had is that physicists don't do things exactly the same way.
Ooh, nice blame shift there.
Pons is correct in saying that their paper was accepted, but he's not being entirely honest here about the peer review. And as for the lack of experimental details, Fleischman hits back with this.
We admit that there were not the experimental details there, but in a preliminary note, there never are these experimental details, and we do now have fax machines and telephones, which would allow people to request that information from us, and those that have, we have given them that advice.
Really? So, no details available on request, and so basically you're putting the burden on people to ask questions of things that you should have already provided. And I'm just thinking, if they actually pulled this off in a meaningful way, wouldn't they want to brag about it? I mean, and just show what sort of process is, show like the elegant simplicity their design has. I can understand the part of lawyering up, protecting the patents, protecting your intellectual property, but saying, we did fusion, how does it work? Well, here's how it kind of works, but if you want to know specifics, call me later when I can get my story straight. That's what it sounds like. I'm not saying that's what they're thinking. It's just sketchy.
Reject that particular criticism.
Indeed, many scientists had been calling the two men non-stop, asking for details. However,
I'm sure.
you either had to be extremely lucky or one of their close friends to actually get a response. Fleischmann plays the diplomat very well here. He makes it clear that he does not want money taken away from hot fusion researchers. He does not want to make any unnecessary enemies. When he's asked how much he thinks scaling up this technology might cost, he is careful to avoid giving an exact number. Rather, he passes that particular hot potato to Chase Peterson, who has brought with him a high-profile lobbyist, Ira Magaziner. Together, they made their Hail Mary pitch to all 42 members of the committee, who listened intently.
The figure that comes to mind is $25 million in the federal government. Maybe that needs to be $125 million someday, but that's of not any importance right now.
Whoa. Can I have $25 million? Keep in mind that I might ask for an additional $100 million in a little bit.
$25 million would allow us to start the onion growing with state and private sources.
$25 million at the low end, $125 at the high end. That is a big ask. Peterson also, in vague terms, alluded to potential national defense concerns about the research. Although cold fusion was not a bomb, fusion was known to produce tritium, a radioactive isotope that is used in making bombs.
In most fusion reactions, tritium actually is not a product, it is a reactant. The tritium reacts with the deuterium, because that generally produces more energy. But here, they're doing deuterium-deuterium fusion, which is pretty rare.
A reliable way to generate tritium would certainly be of use to the US Army. Ira Magaziner tapped into the political fears of the period and described a scenario where Japan, their fearsome economic rival, would swoop in and steal cold fusion from them, just like they had with electronics and automobiles.
You know, we have consulted in Japan, we've consulted with Japanese companies and in the past, and we understand the kind of effort that the Japanese are now devoting to this discovery, even before they've replicated.
This was an existential threat that meant they had to act now to fend it off. The total hearing is 5 hours long.
All the reason, give me my money now, please.
And much of it is dry. As the University of Utah group departed, so did many of their representatives. Most of them simply don't want to stay to listen to the much more skeptical witnesses. Of the other speakers that day, by far the most interesting was the group from Brigham Young University, the rival school to the University of Utah, just 40 miles down the road. And representing them was a very soft-spoken physicist named Stephen Jones. And he was singing a very different tune than Pons and Fleischmann. He didn't think that cold fusion was worth dumping millions into. At least not yet. He had even brought along a prop to help him explain.
I mean, looking at the questionable results by itself, yeah.
Now this is a tender shoot, as you can tell. It is difficult to say what it will become. Some think and suggest strongly that this is a tree, and it will grow up very quickly and provide us enough wood for all our energy needs for generations.
I know where he's going with this.
I do not think it is. I think adding too much fertilizer at this stage will be detrimental. I think we need to give it time, at least a couple of months, please, to see whether this is something that's a rose or a tree. If it should turn out to be a rose, we can then admire it for its beauty, even if we are a bit disappointed it was not a tree.
And by that he...
What a kind way to suggest his disagreement, and funny.
...meant this is a new, unexplored bit of physics, and that is worth studying. But a miracle energy source this was not. To hammer home the point, he made a comparison that the politicians...
Just like the old adage about miracle energy sources. If it works, it's a miracle.
...could easily understand.
On the other hand, I heard Mr. Jones say that the difference between that experiment and commercial productivity was the difference between $1 and the national debt.
For a room of politicians who had just been asked for $25 million, it made a compelling case. But why had he, of all people, been invited? Who even is Stephen Jones? Well, Stephen Jones is the reason any of this was happening at all. What he isn't telling the committee here is that he feels Pons and Fleischmann have fucked him over. Because what he's claiming is that he is the inventor of cold fusion.
Whoa. Ooh, there's gonna be a part 2. I am so excited about that. What a fascinating story. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.